Thank you, Marwa. Well, hello, everyone. I first just want to welcome and thank you all for attending our session. And thank you to the OWHE board members for facilitating the conference. So many thanks to everyone. So first and foremost, I do just want to recognize that it may be a busy time for all of us in higher ed. And we may just trying to be staying afloat with our work and balancing other responsibilities and stressors. So we do appreciate you being here and being present with us, but please do take the time to take care of yourself. If you need to be away, that's completely okay. And please let our session facilitators know if you have any accommodation needs. And now I will kind of introduce myself and then I'll hand it over to my colleague to do the same. My name is Rebecca Rodas, and I use she, her, and ella pronouns. And I'm a student organization advisor at Portland State University. I work in student activities and leadership programs. And let's see, what can I share about myself? I graduated from the University of Oregon. I did some nonprofit work right after college before transitioning into higher ed. Then I started a master's program at PSU in 2018, and then transitioned into this role right before graduating. And a fun fact about me is that I am Salvadoreña. So while I was born in Los Angeles, California, both of my parents were born and raised in El Salvador.
Thanks, Rebecca. Hi, everyone. My name is Yami. That's my nickname. My full name is Yami Lena Taren, so that's maybe why you're thrown off a little bit there. But I use she, her, ella pronouns. I am so happy to be here with you all today, and I'm so happy that we have attendees joining us for this session. Definitely excited about that. I am an admissions counselor at Portland State University, so I work with students from Eastern Oregon and Eastern Washington and a couple of states outside of Oregon. A little bit about myself. I actually grew up and lived in Los Angeles, California up until about a year and a half ago. So I've only been in Portland for about a year and a half, and it was an adjustment getting used to the rain and the gloomy weather, but I've loved it so far, and I love being at PSU. So with that, I did not go to PSU, but I went to school in California, and I was able to get my undergrad in California and my graduate degree in California. And now I'm here, and I'm continuing work in admissions and hope to do that for the next couple of years. But wherever life takes me, I'm open to it. So just happy to be here overall. And with that, we'll jump into our session.
Yeah. And so before we kind of dive in, we just have a brief check-in question for everyone to just put in the chat. And that is, which animal best represents you today and why? It doesn't have to be long. Just drop a short response in the chat just for us to gauge how everyone's feeling today. Oh, I see a sloth getting over a cold. You know, something is going around. I know a few of my colleagues here at PSU are struggling with a cold as well. I'm also a little slothy. Oh, that's always tough when the kiddos don't sleep. That means that the parents don't sleep either. I'm seeing hummingbirds, dog for sure, squirrels, a cat sleeping in a patch of sun. Totoro, Jeanette?
I like the fox, the playful, inquisitive.
A cow, very relaxed. And then I see that Sarah's dog and child didn't sleep last night either, but they have to be hummingbird anyway. And sometimes our work requires us to be like that. Well, wonderful, wonderful. Thank you for sharing, everyone, and thank you for humoring us. And feel free to continue putting in the chat as well. So now I'll go over the agenda before I turn it over to Yami to start us off. Okay, so we had our welcome, and then we're going to start off with capital and kind of defining what capital is and having a brief discussion around that just to ease us into the topic for today. And then I will introduce Yoso's framework of cultural community wealth and the 6 capitals included in his model. Then we will have a breakout room discussion, and hopefully somewhere along the way, there's time allows us for a little break, but we'll kind of gauge that. And then we will briefly be touching upon HSI, so Hispanic Serving Institutions, and undocumented students to supplement our topic and just make those broader connections. And then we will wrap up and hopefully have time for questions at the end. But before we continue and Yami takes over, I just wanted to mention that we will be using the terms Latino, Hispanic, Latine, and Latinx interchangeably. And we acknowledge that there are differences in identities and connotations that come with these terms. But the research that we did, they used all these different terms, and we won't be going too deep into dissecting them as there's quite a bit of context behind them, but just know that they will be used interchangeably during the session.
Thanks, Rebecca. And to just get a little bit of the feel for the room and just ask this question to get a little bit on, get a little bit of what we're thinking about onto a digital board. We were hoping that you could all respond to this question by logging on or clicking on this link to a Jamboard. And so we've posed this question here for you all as, when you hear cultural or social capital, what comes to mind? And it can be as simple as like one word, multiple words, a phrase. I know that there's even a button for an image. So if there's an image that comes to mind or a visual, we just kind of want to see what it is that everyone picks up when they hear this question in terms of what cultural or social capital may mean to them. So I'm seeing credibility, okay. Social mobility, resources, speaking another language. Connections through family and communities, awesome. Network, people who connect you to opportunities. Knowing hidden rules, very cool. Community, college degree being a second gen student versus first. Strength through relationships, community, recognizing differences are assets. Speaking another language other than English. Yeah, these are all great. And these are all ideas that we want to take into the session, and these are great. Social power. Yeah. Awesome. So thank you so much for sharing, everyone. These are definitely points that I myself hadn't even thought about or considered when working through this presentation and building this session. So thank you for sharing. These are great. And with that, we're going to jump into what capital is, and keep these in mind as we're going through the presentation, right? So all of the things that you just shared with us, please keep those in mind as we go through the session. So what is capital? Now, capital is a term that we wanted to define for you all before we jumped into talking about what cultural capital is specifically. So when we talk about capital in this session, we're referring to the currency that buys you a higher position in society. And over time, this capital accumulates and can increase, right, through varying experiences and forms. So Pierre Bourdieu, a sociologist, identified 4 types of capital, which are cultural, social, symbolic, and economic. And for this session, we're just going to focus on cultural capital, which Bourdieu defines. His definition of capital follows a really traditional view and is narrowly defined by a dominant group. So with their definition of capital, it left a deficit view, and that deficit view has impacted communities of color in education specifically. And so with Pierre's definition, they mention a few examples like material belongings that have cultural significance, or symbols of authority, like receiving a degree from a prestigious university. But that has overlooked other forms of capital that also hold enormous value. And so not only has it left communities of color in this deficit view, it just completely overlooks it, right? And undervalues the types of capital that these communities of color actually have. And so this leads into the question of, are there forms of cultural capital that marginalized groups bring to the table? And with the help of critical race theory, we're able to answer this question with a yes. And so Yozo's community cultural wealth model helps to further explain that. And I'll pass this along here to Rebecca.
Yes, thank you, Yami. And thank you for setting the foundation for just the model that we're going to be discussing. So Yozo uses a critical race theory lens to challenge this traditional view that Yami just talked about, right? Capital theory as described by Bordeaux. And it introduces an alternative concept, and that's the community cultural wealth model. And he defines this as an array of knowledge, skills, abilities, and contacts possessed and utilized specifically by communities of color to survive and resist macro and micro forms of oppression. And so there are challenges, right, that communities of color have experienced as a result of socioeconomic status or language barriers, citizenship status, or wherever it may be that produced their reality and circumstances to which then they have needed to adapt to and respond in order to survive and navigate their environment. In doing so, they've developed these capitals and skills to help them. And remember, the idea of capital is a social construct, right? It's socially constructed like race, and it's what we give value to, but it produces real lived experiences and division amongst some groups. So like Yami mentioned, our common understanding and perspective of capital is often defined by the dominant group. And if that's the case, communities of color often fall short of that standard, right? And that's kind of where she mentioned like that deficit perspective. So instead, and you'll see this commonly in, or I guess amplified in predominantly white institutions and communities. And so this model, Yozo's community cultural wealth model, stays away from using that deficit lens and instead highlights the opposite perspective, right? That allows us to view the experiences, skill sets, backgrounds, and everything else that students of colors and students from communities of color bring, and helps us strengthen and cultivate those and build upon them. And so now I will be introducing the 6 capitals that are incorporated in this model. And that's aspirational, linguistic, familial, social, navigational, and resistant. This has been a model that has been used for some programming and has been referenced to in some research. So I'm not sure how familiar everyone is with these capitals or we've heard them before, but hopefully we can provide some examples that will still be useful and relevant to you. So wealth, as Yozo defines this, is the total extent of an individual's accumulated assets and resources. So think of that as wealth rather than, actual like monetary accumulation. And I just want to point out that there's a lot of overlap between these capitals, so please don't think of them as siloed concepts or ideas. They will naturally intersect and overlap to provide a more holistic understanding of student experiences. And some of the examples that we provide may also apply to more than just one capital. And then I will turn it over to Yami to start us off with the first capital.
Thanks, Rebecca. I was having some trouble finding my mute button there. Sorry about that. The first type of capital that we wanted to talk about is aspirational. And this capital emphasizes the idea of maintaining hope even in the face of adversity. So it's really the ability to envision a future beyond the current circumstances and being able to push through to continue working towards your goals. So this is perhaps a type of capital that many first generation students like myself have accumulated throughout our lives. As an example, many first generation students may have parents who work in very labor intensive jobs with long hours, and not to mention on top of that having family responsibilities and so much more going on in their lives. And so students may tend to use or hold on to that hard work that they see their parents performing as motivation and inspiration to keep them going and working towards their dreams and goals. And so along this journey of working towards their goals, students have developed the ability to be resourceful, to take initiative, and also show resiliency. And in talking about aspirational capital, we wanted to pose a couple of questions, and just questions that we considered overall, which include: what assumptions do we have about our students' aspirations? So thinking about myself and my role, and maybe those who share similar roles, if not very different, right? Looking inward and making sure that us as staff or faculty or mentors are checking our own assumptions and biases, and reminding ourselves that each student is unique. So students may have very similar goals to ones that we personally resonate with, while other students may not have goals that we understand right away. So reminding ourselves that we're supporting students in their goals, not determining those goals for them, but helping them along the way. Also asking ourselves, how are we supporting the maintenance of students' aspirations? And so to this question, we came up with a few examples that we thought could be helpful in kicking that off, or kicking us off on the right foot. And one is assessing students' learning styles. Like I mentioned earlier, right, each student is very different. So finding different ways to help students get whatever ideas, dreams they have in their subconscious onto paper or music, or whatever method or format it is that helps them to visualize and realize an idea into something more concrete and tangible. So this could also be like a vision board workshop or an open mic night, anything that continues to fuel them and keep them going. And we also considered creating a mentorship program that allows students to have consistent either peer or professional mentors, where students can share common experiences, bond, and also have mentors serve as guide to students. The second type of capital is linguistic, and this type of capital is the collection of intellectual and social skills that one attains through communication and experiences in more than one language or style. And so linguistic capital looks at the different forms of communication, like those that are written, the arts, music, performing arts, and poetry, all of these mediums that allow us to communicate with different audiences and in different environments. As a personal example, I myself grew up speaking Spanish in my household, and I was able to help translate for my grandparents when someone spoke English and maybe they didn't understand what the other person was saying. And I didn't recognize it then, but now in my current role, I work closely with Spanish speaking families and students, and am able to be a resource to them about college and make them feel included in a conversation that they might not otherwise be included in because of that language barrier. So for me, speaking Spanish has allowed me to find it easy to break down and translate information for Spanish speaking students and families, which in turn has led to really trusting and strong relationships. And so a lot of Latina students may share this experience with me, and throughout their lives have also learned how to code switch in different environments, how to understand social cues, and also adapt maybe sayings or dichos that have allowed them to be better decision makers or storytellers. this leads into how are we supporting the language and communication traits of our students, right? So we know that they may have these skills, they have these talents, these abilities. How are we continuing to support those language and communication skills? And so how are we helping them embrace the fact that speaking a second language or being multilingual or having really great written skills or writing skills, excuse me, is an advantage to bridging gaps, expanding networks, and communicating with audiences that not everyone can do so with. We also want to consider to what degree do courses utilize inclusive pedagogical practices? So how are our teaching practices helping students cultivate this type of capital? And so we don't have direct answers to these questions, but some items or ideas that we thought could be helpful include exploring different methods of communication. So again, this can be done in implementing different advising styles or allowing students to be creative with how they respond to an assignment. Maybe instead of a paper, it's a video or a short podcast or a poem. Also, embedding the value of having 2 or more languages into curriculum. So having the emphasis on language as a benefit on the educational side of things too, right? Maybe a student wants to pursue a minor in a second language. Also, creating service learning opportunities for students. This can include connecting students with local organizations, professors, departments across campus that need support and can provide students with maybe the opportunity to strengthen those linguistic skills. And lastly, trainings and workshops during onboarding for staff and faculty. So this involves workshops and sessions that would help faculty and staff learn about communication styles across cultures and learn a little bit more in depth about the population that they're serving at their respective institutions. Now, the third type of capital is familial, and familial capital refers to the cultural knowledge obtained from family or kin. And this type of capital highlights the life lessons that students can learn from their families, friends, support systems, and community support too. So when we talk about family, it doesn't necessarily mean that they have to be your direct family or closely related to you, but folks in your community that you grew up with or developed close relationships with. And from these fostered relationships, students can draw wisdom, values, stories that they all carry with them and then apply in their daily interactions with friends, with family, in educational spaces, and in workspaces too. So for some students, we can see the support come through as a home cooked meal or when a family member can be a listening ear or when parents who aren't familiar with the process are super open to learning more about that process because it means something to their loved one. And so with that, we thought, how do we recognize and help students draw on wisdom, values, and stories from their home communities? And that question came to mind, right? Because we want to make sure that we're providing an opportunity for students to highlight their family, to embrace those connections that they've made. And so something that professors or faculty can do includes implementing assignments that highlight family ties and exploring family or community roots. The next question that we wanted to pose to was how do we create environments that honor and invite families to participate? So one example that I can use is at Portland State, we recently incorporated café con pan mixers, so coffee with bread on the side, and that invites Spanish-speaking families and students to meet Spanish-speaking professors and staff at PSU to learn more about the university and to also feel part of the campus community. So developing bilingual or multilingual and family inclusive orientation sessions is one way of building those environments where families feel their most authentic selves. And we'll go ahead and jump into social capital with Rebecca.
Thank you, Yami. And thank you for bearing with us. I know that in just talking about the capitals, it's a lot of just like us talking, but hopefully we'll get to a chance for you all get to share too. So social capital is peer and social contacts that students draw upon and utilize to navigate college enrollment process and other institutions. So we know that communities of colors tend to come from more collectivist cultures, right? And share not only traditions and values through their communities, but also information and resources. And so students draw upon these community contacts where there may not be any power dynamics to help them through their educational journey, especially as they transition to college. And so here are some questions that we can ask ourselves to cultivate and strengthen student social capital. How do we help students stay connected to the communities and individuals instrumental to their educational success? And then how do we engage with these individuals and community-based organizations about admissions and selection processes and the types of support students need? And so these questions kind of guide the examples that we provide, right? And so the first one that I have on here is cultural specific orientations. And you know how I mentioned a lot of some of the things that we bring up may overlap. And so the Café con Pan mixer that Yami mentioned actually is a great example of how to foster that social capital as well, right? And they're important in many ways because it's setting up the foundation for their educational journey. These orientations are. And it's communicating to the students that we as an institution value your family and anyone that is important to you that has been a support, and we want to help you cultivate that community. Summer Bridge programming, right? So specifically aimed at underrepresented students, you may want to think about collaborating with relevant community organizations that may already offer scholarships and other educational support that you can promote or even streamline to your institution. So if you work in admissions, you can partner with them to kind of set these opportunities up, right? And tap into some of their contacts of the students they're already serving. And this is intended to build their social capital, their social support network with peers who share similar experiences to them, right? And building that support as well as their resources and information toolkit. And just make sure with this, I know there's a lot of summer bridge programming already at institutions, so just make sure that you're not duplicating efforts, but rather expanding and strengthening the programming that is already in place. So just make sure you're connecting with the right folks in order to do that. And then academic career networking opportunities. There has to be some intentionality with bridging some of their academic goals with career paths. And in this scenario, you know, as we were discussing this with Yami, we thought, you know, bringing in Latina community professionals, bringing them in to share their experiences and resources, because as the keynote speaker mentioned earlier, Sarah Cooten, representation and mentorship in professionals is so important, right? Seeing people that look like them, that they can identify with, and seeing yourself reflected in someone's story who is by your definition successful, and seeing how they turn their aspirations into attainable goals, that's impactful. And you want to make sure there's consistency and exposure of these networking opportunities in different spaces, right? So we don't want to keep these opportunities siloed in just cultural support spaces. We want to see them across general academic advising, career services, in the academic department, right? In exposure of this in classrooms. And we need to be proactive about letting them know about these things. And then just quickly, the skills section that we have in each of these slides are what students can articulate this capital into, for example, on their resume. And in this sense, it would be effective communication, relationship building, and teamwork and collaboration. Then we have Navigational Capital, and that is kind of as it sounds, the skills of maneuvering through social institutions historically. This infers the ability to maneuver through institutions not created with communities of color in mind. So students get used to drawing upon, you know, whether that be social community contacts and learning from what has worked in the past when they are met with oppressive and exclusionary and maybe even racist practices in different social spheres and institutions, you know, K through 12 schooling, job market, healthcare, judicial system, These experiences have allowed them to develop this critical navigational capital and skills to persevere, and they bring those with them as they enter our college campuses. It probably just looks a little bit different, right? It may not look like them going to staff and admin right away, but they are drawing upon their social contacts to navigate. And some questions to consider are how we help students navigate our institutions, interactions with teachers and faculty, and then interactions with student support staff, their peers. Like, how are we helping them navigate these? And how willing are we to acknowledge that our institutions, both their structures and cultures, have a history of, and may still in many ways be unsupportive and or hostile to our students and their communities? So again, these questions will guide the examples that we provide. And so the first thing that Yami and I were discussing is accessibility. So think about how students are navigating the website, the usability of it, right? Like your school website, or even like a program website, using intentional language. What is intuitive to admin may not be intuitive to them. And how are we marketing or showcasing that information and who we are reaching, right? There has to be intentionality behind the process. If we're not reaching them, if we're not meeting them where they're at, then we're not really, this support is not getting to them. And then how easy is it for students to find support and services, both virtually and physically? Again, going back to this idea of like, are they in siloed pockets? Are they limited to cultural spaces, or are they embedded in every space of the institution? And that goes along with centralizing support services. You have to think about also how this support overlaps with other types of support and other identities, such as, for example, the Disability Resource Centers, the Queer and Trans Resource Center, and other spaces on campus, and how these things are intersecting and overlapping. For centralizing support services, I encourage you to think about the org chart and the physical space. Do things make sense? Are students having to jump through hoops and get tossed back and forth because of how things are structured? Being intentional with how we build a cohesive foundation for students to navigate and where they can build community. And hopefully, once we put some intentionality of like how things are structured, that eliminates one thing for them to navigate, and then they can start seeing consistency in staff and start seeing consistency in the folks who attend those spaces and start building those communities. Data-informed practices. So this is a little straightforward, and just, use surveys, feedback forms, focus groups to identify key navigational challenges that the student population has, and then use that to inform the practices of student, staff, and faculty, right? And just, this is kind of like a general, just making sure that we're assessing our systems and structures, periodically. And I think the last one is really important. Include students in decision-making processes. I want to emphasize that students are the experts on what they need, and we should encourage them not only to navigate these spaces, but to create their own, right? And to make it their own. So let's provide leadership development opportunities for them and invite them into hiring committees, research projects, student staff advisory councils, strategic planning, conducting perhaps SWOT analysis of programming, and SWOT stands for strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. Basically, when you're assessing a program or whatever it is that it may be, it is helping them shape the campus structure and policy in a way that makes sense for them. And keep in mind that some of these students, because they've been historically left out of a lot of these spaces, they may not always be too outspoken. So finding ways to get their input that is not just speaking up, like I said, like feedback forms, or getting creative with this too. And some of the skills that this can articulate to or translate to is problem solving, determine, multitasking, creativity, resourcefulness, resilience, connectivity, and visionary. And the last of the capitals is resistant capital. knowledge and skills fostered through oppositional behavior that challenges inequality, right? So he also talks about the contradictions that Latina mothers face as they try to teach their daughters to, and they use it in a Spanish dicho, valerse por sí misma, which means value themselves and be self-reliant within structures of inequality, such as racism, patriarchy, and capitalism. These young women are learning to be oppositional, not only with their bodies, but their minds, spirits, in the face of race, gender, and all the other isms of inequity. And so he also reveals that the resistance may include different forms of oppositional behavior, which I thought was interesting. So it can look like self-defeating or conformist strategies. So essentially assimilation, but it is when the students start to develop awareness of oppression and the motivation to work towards social and racial justice that then resistance takes on a transformative form. And so resistant capital, as we are referring to, includes knowledge, right? Cultural knowledge of structural racism and knowledge of these oppressive practices and the motivation to transform them, which I thought was very, very interesting. And so questions that we have for you all is, how do we support students who are committed to engaging in and serving their home communities, however they define these? And what opportunities do we provide students in and outside of the classroom to prepare them for participation in a diverse democracy? Some of the first things that I noted here is involvement in student organizations and student government. So cultivating students' involvement in student government and groups such as, Mecha, Las Mujeres, other cultural and identity-based student groups, just to name a few, that will help students cultivate their voice, their advocacy skills, and as a result, they will start fostering communities with others in those groups, right, that share a common goal. And then cultivate self-authorship. So I don't know if there's any PACE program folks in here, but going back to student development theory to complement critical race theory. But self-authorship is defined as the internal capacity to define one's own beliefs, identity, and social relations. It is a belief that you can rely on your own internal values to make decisions. And so it requires people to stand really strong in their values and being able to reflect in order to guide their actions and decision making. And so you want to make sure that you integrate this in leadership programming, right? Combat imposter syndrome. Sarah talked about that as well earlier. How are we actively helping our students combat imposter syndrome? Being intentional with cultivating one-on-one relationships and touch points to build that self-confidence, validating their experiences, reflecting them, like Yami mentioned earlier, in our curriculum and leadership program, reflecting their experiences. Consider your advising approach or philosophy, and possibly also build presence, increase the presence and the visibility. The visibility is very important, as we've talked about representation, that visible aspect, perhaps quarterly luncheons or workshops on varying social justice topics, but that's very visible. And that's where we need to hold the institution accountable, right? This work should not just fall on the backs of cultural support spaces or identity-based groups. It should be the responsibility of the institution. Community organizing and activism kind of goes along with encouraging partnerships and collaborations. Encourage collaborations with leaders, mentors, and community professionals that are doing the work they're passionate about. And as staff, we can proactively reach out to these organizations and start building those relationships and setting things in place, right, to streamline those connections for the students. And that translates over to advocacy skills, adaptability, resiliency, authenticity, and self-awareness. And I think just for the sake of time, we're going to skip over the break and then just jump into, I'm thinking we can just wrap up with our breakout session and then a little share out back, just to give everyone a chance to reflect on everything that we just mentioned. So feel free to, our session facilitator is going to put everyone into breakout rooms, and feel free to look over these questions and just discuss these in your breakout rooms.
All right, everyone should be back.
Well, welcome back, everyone. Hopefully those discussions in the breakout room, we tried to give you as much time as possible, but like any session, we were short on time, and there's just so much good information that we wanted to share, but hopefully those discussions were an opportunity for you all to share and be able to bounce off ideas, be able to just reflect more on the capitals and what we've talked about here today. But we were hoping to maybe have one or two people, if there's anything that you strongly feel that was shared in your session or in your breakout room that you wanted to share with the larger group, if you have something that you would like to share with us, please feel free to like unmute yourself, or if it's something that you feel more comfortable with putting in the chat, feel free to put it in the chat as well. But just hoping to hear back from some and have this small discussion in the last 2 minutes that we have. And it can be as simple as like a word that maybe summarizes what your discussion was like in your breakout sessions. If there's a type of capital that stuck out to you the most, if there's something new that you learned here today, or something that you're going to take from today's session and start doing, stop doing, or maybe keep doing, anything that you feel comfortable with sharing in the chat or with unmuting yourself too. Thank you, Holly. So Holly mentioned, I love this presentation, wish I had more time to contemplate these themes in a community with y'all. I totally agree with you. These 50 minutes seemed like 10. I'm so sorry about that. I wanted to spend more time in particular thinking about resistant capital. Yeah, definitely. That is one that me and Rebecca definitely went on for hours on end talking about and just going more in detail. Thank you for sharing. Okay, Eleanor, the term resistive capital was new to me, but I'll be reflecting on that one. Yeah. And I'm looking forward to thinking more about how to incorporate these sources of capital into my career advising and teaching. That's awesome. Please let us know of any cool ideas that you come up with. Excited to see what that looks like. Sarah, my group talked a little bit about navigational capital and the importance of having faculty and staff who look like or have similar cultural background to you as a student. That's awesome. Thank you for sharing. Ida, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. Someone shared Empower Hour as an event for Latine and other students to network with recent grads who share their identities. That's an amazing idea. That is definitely something that will help students feel more supported and being able to see someone in the shoes that maybe they're hoping to fill one day, if not step into. So that's awesome. Thank you so much for sharing, everyone. And we know we're at 3:20 and we've hit that time. And with that, we want to make sure that we're not taking any more time from you so that you can hop into those next sessions and take a break in between. But we really just want to say thank you for joining us here today. We didn't get to go through the whole presentation, but please know that we have our slides in the Google Drive available for you all to download if you would like, as well with a information sheet that is titled as a resource sheet on the drive. So please feel free to check those out, and that way you get the full session, full presentation here today that we couldn't go into detail right now, but at least you'll have it to take with you. Rebecca, anything that you want to mention?
Just that I put in the information sheet resource that we want you all to take in the chat. And that's just like a quick one pager that gives you an overview of these capitals and also shows you how you can incorporate that in your work. But thank you everyone for taking the time to attend our session.